Hi everyone. So I'm from the University of Melbourne and my supervisor is Dr. Simon Lamb. And this is basically some research that we did this year for my honours project. So it's still a work in progress, even though I submitted my thesis just like 2 weeks ago, really stressful. So the last bit of the data is actually really new. So I would really appreciate your feedback on it. And we collected a huge, rich set of data that we replicated. And I would love your feedback on how to actually interpret and then maybe analyze it and add a few more variables as well. So we all know that migration is obviously a pertinent issue, and that's why we're all here. And one of the main solutions that has been proposed by the UNHCR is integration of different migrant groups into host communities. But to actually integrate migrant groups, we first need to understand public attitudes towards them. But my supervisor and I think that there are actually two main challenges to understanding how people actually feel towards different groups. So one of the challenges is that migrants are typically portrayed in a very homogeneous and holistic lens, typically in the media, where a lot of different migrant categories are actually bunched up into one single category, especially the distinctions between refugees and asylum seekers sometimes tend to be ignored. So economic migrants or skilled migrants usually migrate via skill-based visa, whereas refugees migrate via humanitarian visa. So one of the distinctions between refugees and asylum seekers is that asylum seekers usually, more often than not, do not actually have visa prior to entry. But host nations are obligated under international law to process all asylum seekers arriving on shore to determine whether they will be granted refugee status or not. But because these groups are portrayed in a holistic lens, sometimes the subtle distinctions between these groups can actually be lost. And one of the problems with this is that these auras sometimes surrounding illegality of asylum seekers can be transferred to other groups, and for example, refugees, and all groups can then tend to be portrayed as illegal immigrants. And why this is important to clarify is because in a research context, when we actually ask people to differentiate between groups, they end up doing so. So a lot of Australian studies have shown that participants tend to express more negative attitudes towards asylum seekers compared to refugees. And this is surrounded by more threat perceptions and perceiving asylum seekers as queue jumpers and taking places of others. So it is really important to distinguish between those groups because by separating the groups, we might actually get a clearer picture of why people are reacting this way. A second issue that we noted is in the measurement of prejudice. So prejudice is usually measured as an attitude or a broad, general, unfavorable feeling towards a particular group. So this measure in and of itself is not a problem, but if we want to make specific predictions of how people might actually behave towards groups, it might actually be insufficient to rely on global general attitude evaluations. So in current prejudicial frameworks, we cannot actually make specific predictions of how people might react towards specific migrant groups. And taking a functionalist perspective, some more nuanced accounts of prejudice have been theorized. So for example, integrated threat theory, which Victoria S. is also part of, has described sources of prejudice in terms of threats. So actually looking at what predicts different attitudes towards groups. So then we can ask another question, can we actually predict behaviors towards groups like we can predict attitudes? So can threat perceptions predict behaviors, and through what mechanism can this actually happen? So that is where the sociofunctional account of prejudice comes in. So this account, proposed by Cottrell and Newberg around 10 years ago, says that broad attitude evaluations are actually insufficient in explicating prejudice. So what this theory says that the reason why an attitude might be insufficient to predict behavior is because an attitude that is grounded in fear versus an attitude that is grounded in anger might actually produce different behaviors. So standard accounts of prejudice might imply that two equally negative attitudes might produce the same negative behavior towards the two different groups. So what the SFA posits instead is that we need to look at the specific nature of prejudice and the emotional texturing underlying prejudice. So what they say is that specific groups pose specific threats, which then lead to specific emotional reactions, and then it's the emotion that actually drives functionally adaptive behaviors towards each of the groups. So the crucial part of this theory is firstly that it's emotions that actually drive behaviors, and secondly, that different groups will actually have different pathways and different behaviors. So for example, realistic threat is a materialistic threat, which is hypothesized to induce anger and then aggression. So we also included measures of policy support, just because behaviors don't necessarily have to be in a very obvious, direct, confrontational manner. So for example, an analogous behavior could be restrictive policy. So supporting restrictive policy, for example, supporting governments that say we should restrict annual intake of migrants and things like that. So symbolic threat is threat to cultural norms, which can predict disgust and avoidance of a group. And we have threat to in-group health, which can also predict disgust and avoidance. On the other hand, threat to group safety or physical safety can predict fear and avoidance. We also can have some sympathetic reactions. For example, threat to reciprocity, because we perceive the out-group as unable to give back to the in-group, can predict pity and then approach. And similarly, threat to in-group moral image. So perceiving that the in-group has committed something morally wrong towards the out-group can predict guilt and subsequent approach or support for acceptance policy, like providing subsidies. So it's really important to remember that each threat elicits a particular emotion, and it's the emotion that's driving this action tendency, and that's the basic premise of this theory. So what we did was extend this theory to this migrant context and see what type of threats, emotions, and behaviors emerge for each of these three groups. So our first research question was to see if migrant groups are actually distinguishable based on general attitude evaluations. So the reason why we did this is because a lot of Australian research has shown that asylum seekers tend to be viewed more negatively compared to refugees in a broad sense. Secondly, a more focal research question was to see if general attitudes are grounded in particular emotions. So if, for example, two groups have the same negative attitude, are they still predicted by different emotions? And that will suggest something about the specific nature of prejudice. And our most important research question was to see if these threat emotion behavior pathways are contingent upon migrant membership. So to do this, we sampled undergraduates from the University of Melbourne, and they were all Australian citizens to avoid sampling from the target groups. The majority were Australian-born, Caucasian, and also mostly liberal. So they completed an online survey, and it was a within subjects design. Everybody answered the questions pertaining to all three groups, but the order was counterbalanced to avoid order effects. So before participants completed the threat, emotion, attitudes, and behavior measures, we first gave definitions of all the three groups and asked them to complete comprehension questions to ensure that they actually understood the differences before proceeding, keeping in mind that this is an undergraduate sample and they might not be fully aware of the differences between groups. So in regards to our first question, we actually found, consistent with previous Australian studies, that refugees tend to be viewed more positively compared to both asylum seekers and economic migrants. But even more interestingly, there was no significant difference between attitudes towards asylum seekers and economic migrants, which are also very different groups with very different circumstances. So then we wanted to see if these equal attitudes were nevertheless grounded in different emotions. And they are. So we conducted 3 separate regressions to see individual predictors of attitudes towards these groups. So we already know that different types of threats, from example, research from integrated threat theory can predict attitudes. So here we wanted to see for each of the groups what emotions were predicting their attitudes. And we can see that for respect emerged as sort of a universal predictor, but higher anger predicted more negative attitudes towards economic migrants. So just keeping in mind that this scale was measuring, our attitude scale, was asking people on a scale of 0 to 100, how favorable do you feel towards a group? So if participants answered, for example, 80, it means they meant more favorable, which was the case for refugees. And fear predicted attitudes towards refugees, but we see the lack of pity predicting more negative attitudes towards asylum seekers. So even if we have equal negative attitudes, they may nevertheless be grounded in distinct emotions. So our main analysis was a structural equation modeling to see which type of threats predicted what type of emotion, and then what kind of emotion uniquely predicted a particular behavior, controlling for all the other emotions and all the other threats. So the threat emotion behavior relationships we got was looking at unique threats predicting unique emotions and then the corresponding behavior. So we made sure all the other threats and emotions were already accounted for. So for economic migrants, we see threat to materialistic well-being and physical safety threat, both predicting fear and then avoidance or intentions to avoid this group. So the key thing is that I haven't included direct effects here of threats on avoidance just because none of the direct effects were significant. So it was emotions that were doing all the work. So the relationships between threats and behaviors were driven by the emotion. And conversely, we see reciprocity threat predicting less respect and less tendency to approach this group. On the other hand, for refugees, we see threat to cultural norms predicting less respect and less tendency to approach this group. And interestingly, we see in-group morality threat emerging. So threat to moral image predicting more pity and then greater support for acceptance-related policies. So that is something, importantly, we did not see for economic migrants. Similarly, for asylum seekers, we see this threat to in-group moral image, feeling that we have committed something morally wrong to the out-group, predicting guilt, and then greater support for acceptance-related policies. So in line with the sociofunctional count, we definitely see different threats emerging for each of the groups, and we see different emotions and then behaviors. So for economic migrants, we see materialistic threat, but for refugees and asylum seekers, we instead see in-group moral image threat emerging. And so we find basic support for the premise of the sociofunctional count, saying that we should be distinguishing between these groups and behaviors can importantly differ between them. Then we wanted to see if we can replicate this study in the US. The reason why we chose the US is because they have a long history of migration, and it was really interesting because my thesis ended somewhere close to 1 week before the election. So it'd be really interesting to see how that actually informed perceptions of US citizens. So we sampled 171 American citizens who completed questionnaires through Mechanical Turk, who were mostly actually, from memory, Republican supporters, but at around 30%, and we had 20% Democrats, and the rest were other parties or libertarian. There's quite a huge sample that was libertarian. And however, they all reported being around 50% or liberal on political issues. And we haven't looked at how political orientation actually mediates these variables. So that is something that might be interesting to look at. So they just completed the same survey, but just tailored to the US context. And it was really interesting because, firstly, compared to the Australian context, attitudes were a lot lower. So we had around maybe 75, 80 in the Australian context. US, it was median 60, and there was no differences in attitudes between groups. So everyone was viewed as equally negative. But we see anger emerging for economic migrants, which was also consistent with the Australian context. We see fear and disgust towards refugees, and then we see the lack of pity predicting more negative attitudes towards asylum seekers. So we see that even though attitudes were basically equal between all the three groups, it's different things that are actually predicting these attitudes. So looking at these threat emotion behavior relationships, very similar to the Australian context, we saw again physical safety threat emerging, materialistic threat emerging in the US as well. For refugees, we actually found also a similar relationship to economic migrants in the US. So again, materialistic threat, physical safety threat, perceptions of fear, and intentions to avoid this group as well. Again, for asylum seekers, it's materialistic threat, predicting anger, and then aggression towards this group. So just a quick comparison with the Australian context. A lot of it was similar for economic migrants, except in this last relationship, where we had reciprocity threat emerging in Australia, but not in the US. For refugees, there were quite a few differences. We actually didn't find any similarities between the relationships, but most notably, we see this sort of sympathetic response in the Australian context, where we see this in-group moral image contributing to, pro-sociality, and we do not see this emerging in the US. Same story for asylum seekers, where actually we see contrasting behavioral intentions and contrasting threats emerging. We see this in-group morality threat and guilt emerging in the Australian sample, but we see anger and aggression emerging in the States, which is also very interesting. So just to summarize, we see mainly materialistic threat or realistic threat perceptions emerging in the US. And another important difference is that we don't see any concurrent sympathetic responses. But this may be due to the rhetoric surrounding the election, as this data was collected just 1 week prior to the election. So it's important to realize that situational context can affect people's threat and emotion appraisals, regardless of what they actually feel. And that might be one explanation for these differences. So in general, we see support for the sociofunctional account in both countries in the sense that we can get different threat emotion profiles and behaviors depending on the group that we're considering. And also this points to the importance of going beyond a single general attitude evaluation measure to make predictions specifically about behavior. And there are some cross-cultural similarities. So we see materialistic threat consistently emerging for economic migrants in both the US and Australian samples, but we also see some cross-cultural differences. So in-group morality was only observed in Australia, for example. Of course, this has some implications for the theory that we used. So although we have broad support for this theory, there is a lot of outstanding questions because this theory is just starting to be used really recently. And the sociofunctional account, one of the main problems is that it proposes one-to-one mapping of constructs. So this particular threat should lead to this emotion and this behavior, but that sort of ignores the situation and cultural influences that you can have between countries. And as we saw, there might be some very important cultural or situational influences that can affect those threat emotion behavior relationships. So just in terms of theory, this means that, yes, we should differentiate between groups in research, and also hopefully this would be extended to the media someday, and a single attitude measure might not actually be used to predict or to make more nuanced observations towards these different groups. And what this means on a practical level is that we might need more nuanced anti-prejudice frameworks to actually understand and design more effective anti-prejudice interventions. So if we take a particular migrant group, we might have to look at particular threats and particular emotions if we want to change attitudes and behaviors towards those groups. So to change behaviors and attitudes towards a group has to be contingent upon what exactly that group is and what is driving reactions towards those groups. So just to end on a more positive note, is there a way that we can actually induce pro-sociality towards traditionally disadvantaged groups? So for example, would making this in-group morality threat more salient lead to greater pro-sociality? especially in the Australian context. And what about inducing or changing feelings of pity and guilt? Because in this study we saw that pity and guilt were significant predictors of prosociality. And we see a lot of emotion theorists have done this before in the States, and changing pity and guilt has been shown to actually change people's prosocial intentions towards, for example, African Americans in the US and also native Aboriginal Australians. So further research could look at experimental studies, seeing if we can change particular threat and emotion appraisals to actually induce more positive behaviors towards these groups. Thank you.